Today is Monday, October 27, 2014, the 300th day of the year. There are 65 days remaining until the end of 2014. On this day in 312 of the Christian era, Constantine the Great is said to have received his famous vision of the cross. Constantine, the 57th emperor of the Roman Empire, from 306 to 337 AD, 31 years, known to campaign against tribes along the edges of his empire, the Franks, the Alemanni, the Goths. He builds an imperial residence at Byzantium in present-day Asia Minor and renames it Constantinople. The empire divided four ways from within a tetrarchy, the most power before 312 AD devolving to Maxentius in the west and Constantine in the east. Constantine means to unite east and west into one empire with himself as the one true old-school Roman emperor. In the evening on this day in 312, the sixth year of his reign, as Constantine's army prepares for battle with his rival for the throne, Maxentius, as written by Roman historian Eusebius in his Life of Constantine, Constantine sees above the lowering sky a sign, a vision in the sky of what comes to be known as the Roman cross, a sign of the Christ, and words in Greek, usually translated into Latin as in hoc signo vinces, or in English, by this sign you will conquer. Eusebius says Constantine is unsure of the meaning of his vision. What can possibly be the confusion? Kill the bastards before they kill you. But that night, he dreams that Jesus himself comes to him and tells him to use this symbol upon the shields of his army, and they will become invincible in the name of Christ. In so doing, Constantine victorious in the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, defeating his chief rival for Roman power, Maxentius, who drowns in the Tiber River. Constantine becomes sole emperor of Rome, ruling an empire that extends from Britannia to Asia Minor. Wherever particular people congregate, Pall Mall cigarettes, introduced in America in 1907, uses that same slogan, in hoc signo vinces, under the insignia on the front of each package. Pall Mall's, since 2012, the best-selling brand of smokes on the market. Pall Mall uses another Latin slogan within the insignia itself, per aspera ad astra, or through thorns to the stars, interpreted as, first, you burn the bejesus out of your throat, then you die slowly and in great pain. Author Kurt Vonnegut, a Pall Mall addict himself, writes something similar, that smoking Pall Malls is a classy way to commit suicide. On this day in 1936, Mrs. Wallis Warfield Spencer Simpson, 40, files for divorce, which would allow her to marry King Edward VIII of the United Kingdom, thus forcing his abdication from the throne. The American Mrs. Simpson is 38 years old and twice married, once divorced in 1934 when she begins a tempestuous affair with Edward, the Prince of Wales, called David, the seventh of his given names. Until he meets Mrs. Simpson, Edward is the playboy prince with a predilection for women of experience. As who isn't? There are those who question why the Prince of Wales falls so hard for Mrs. Simpson, who is said to have certain manly qualities. Although weak men are often only able to become aroused sexually at the behest of aggressive women, and with the attention of such women transform, perhaps chemically, into, at the least, adequate lovers. Terrific for him, but what's in it for her? Mrs. Simpson, well known to be voracious, perhaps insatiable in that department, as demonstrated by her impatience with her husbands, whom she leaves at home when socializing, then discards when she chooses. Edward's friend, Edward de Courcy, in a 1995 BBC Channel 4 documentary says, "I've never known in the course of a long life one person so utterly possessed by another as he was by her." Mrs. Simpson is not the first married woman with whom Edward falls in love. His affair, beginning in spring 1918 with Mrs. Winifred Frida Dudley Ward, the mother of two young girls, continues until 1934, when Edward meets Mrs. Simpson at the home of the Lady Furness, another woman of a certain maturity and experience whom Edward is seeing. Edward drops Mrs. Dudley Ward like a hot rock. Mrs. Simpson's appetites soon proved to be perfectly complementary to Edward's as to her political views, a marked sympathy for Nazi Germany. That Channel 4 documentary accuses Edward directly of saying he greatly admires the social reforms Hitler puts into place, and he says England should extend to Nazi Germany the hand of friendship. Edward's father, King George V, accuses his son of unconstitutional behavior by intervening in foreign affairs and making pro-Nazi statements. The king predicts in a statement to the conservative Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, "After I'm dead, the boy will ruin himself within 12 months." The king's remark is prescient. George V dies in January 1936 at Sandringham House, Norfolk. Edward VIII reluctantly ascends the throne. 2 months later, Hitler's Nazis march into the Rhineland in defiance of international treaties, secure in the knowledge that the King of England is on his side. The new king makes clear in public and private conversations that his views and the views of the British government with regard to foreign affairs are at odds. Edward insists upon influencing matters abroad. Details about British cabinet meetings find their way to the German ambassador to England, von Ribbentrop, through a series of visits made openly to the German embassy by the king's mistress, Mrs. Simpson. On this day in 1936, Mrs. Simpson is granted divorce from her New York shipbroker husband, Ernest Simpson, most ironically charging him with adultery, having caught him, she claims, in flagrante delicto, with her childhood friend Mary Kirk. Well, her ex-friend at best. The final decree will enable her to marry yet again within 6 weeks. The open affair between Edward and Mrs. Simpson, known widely in Britain, though not yet reported in the British press, and Mrs. Simpson's wild unsuitability as a twice-divorced American woman to reign as Britain's queen, provide an opportunity for powers behind the throne to force Edward out of the monarchy and into exile. On December 11, 1936, Edward VIII abdicates. He's England's king for 326 days, the shortest reign of any British king except for Edward V of the House of York, who's king for 83 days, the boy king who dies in 1483 at the age of 13 in the Tower of London. His death widely attributed, notably by William Shakespeare, to Richard III, himself a not particularly long-lived monarch. Edward goes on the radio to address the nation.
But you must believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love. And I want you to know that the decision I have made has been mine and mine alone.
As Duke and Duchess of Windsor, Edward and Mrs. Simpson live in France before war prompts them to move to Biarritz, Spain, Portugal, the Bahamas. In 1937, the couple enjoys a much-publicized visit with Hitler at Berchtesgaden. Hitler reported to have been much taken with Mrs. Simpson, saying about her, "What a woman. She would have made a good queen. Now, get the heck out of here. I got a million things to do." Karl Alexander, Duke of Württemberg, who later becomes a Benedictine monk, reports that while in London, living with Edward when he's still King of England, Mrs. Simpson is having it on with von Ribbentrop, the Nazi ambassador, during her afternoon visits to the German embassy. The story that she keeps a framed photograph of von Ribbentrop at her bedside table throughout the war years so she can gaze upon it as Edward attempts to make love to her cannot possibly be confirmed. Other sources, perhaps equally questionable, say the Ribbentrop portrait story is true, but it is there more to inspire the Duke of Windsor than his Duchess. British wartime Prime Minister Winston Churchill says, "Diplomacy is the art of telling people to go to hell in such a way that they ask for directions." From Rutland, Vermont, this is Richard Alcott speaking.